So welcome everyone. Glad you're here for Church Now Conversations. These conversations are an opportunity to think about ministry and mission right in the moment. And we're just excited that you're spending some time with us. I'm Larry Dornbos. I'm the head of Vibrant Congregations, which helps churches figure out how to take fresh steps in ministry and mission. It's a joint work of the RCA and CRC. And I'm really excited that Vibrant is able to do this along with our partners, Center for Church Renewal, Pillar Church, Holland Classes Holland, Resonate Global Ministry, Healthy Church, Discernment Process. All of these different folks, Luminex, are joining together to bring these conversations to you. In a moment, we're going to hear from Todd Bolsinger, but I want to just say a couple of things before then. One is that Todd's new book is coming out in about a month, and it's about resilient leadership. And if you are interested in being part of a cohort that talks about that and says, how can we apply this to our life as leaders in our church? Vibrant Congregations beginning in January is going to sponsor cohorts. And if you'd like to be part of a cohort, just go to our website, vibrantcongregations.org, and you can sign up for a cohort there. We also on our site have Mission Insight, which is a demographic, ethnographic tool that you can get for free. It's about a $300 value. And so if you want to know more about what's going on around your current church, around your neighborhood, who's out there a little bit, we invite you to also check that out on our website. But a couple other notes, and that is during this time, we're just going to ask that you stay muted. If you have a question you want to ask, put it into the chat, and we've got a couple of people watching for those questions, and they'll transfer them over to Todd, and you can have your questions answered. And also, we're going to do breakout rooms part of the way through, and so you will be sent to those breakout rooms. You need to do nothing. You'll be brought back from them. You need to do nothing. And in the breakout rooms, just take a moment, introduce each other, and then Todd will have a question for us. Just have some conversation around in those breakout rooms. So with that, going to just pass it off to you, Mike, and let you introduce Todd for us. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. And what a joy it is to introduce Todd. He is Associate Professor of Leadership Formation and Senior Fellow at the Dupree Center for Leadership at Fuller Theological Seminary. He is an in-demand speaker, I would say more in demand now maybe than ever. Consultant, blogger, author of several books. Perhaps you're familiar with Canoeing the Mountains. That's had a tremendous impact on so many of us, our churches, our organizations, and ourselves. And of course, Tempered Resilience is coming out in just about a month, as Larry mentioned. Todd is married to Beth. They have 2 children. And it's just a delight to welcome Todd. He is one of the, I think, foremost and wise leaders that we can listen to and learn from when it comes to adaptive leadership, particularly maybe now more than ever. So whether you do a thumbs up or a virtual clap or however you want to do it, but let's warmly welcome Todd Bolsinger.
Mike, thanks very much. It's very kind of you all. Nice to see your faces across the screen and to know that we're crossing the miles. It is 8 o'clock in the morning here in California, and it looks like it's going to be a beautiful day. If you've been aware of California, we've had a lot of smoke and fires and all the kinds of things that have been contributing to our being in the news. But it seems like we're now beginning to enter into fall, and it's pretty nice for us in that sense at the moment. It is good to be with you at a time where we're going to talk about the notion of the kind of resilience needed to lead in a disruptive world. And if you're at all like me, you're probably in need of a shot of some encouragement and some resilience at the moment. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to assume it works. When I would travel, I would always want to travel with an 11-year-old to handle my technology, but we'll see if I can manage this one myself. And I'll take you through some material, and then we'll have some conversation about that. So what I really want to talk about is this notion of hewing hope and the mountain of despair, resilience for change leaders. When Canoeing the Mountains came out in 2015, I began to do a lot more speaking and traveling around the country. It's where I met people like Mike and others in lots of different gatherings. And I found myself having this conversation over and over again. I would get to talk about Canoeing the Mountains and talk about adaptive change, and people would take lots of notes and they would engage in great conversation. And then somebody like Mike would take me to dinner, and usually there would be somebody a couple of other pastors with us. And then eventually someone would kind of like drop their guard and say, I don't worry about whether I can learn to lead change. I worry about whether I can survive it. And the tenor of the conversation changed over and over. And this happened literally in almost every meal around the world. Because what we began to realize is what was so difficult about leading change was not the technique or even the approach or even the wisdom, it was the resilience. It's what happens to us when we are having to face that kind of stress and struggle every single day. And that took me on a journey where I began to listen more deeply to the way in which leaders were bucking up and were being formed to be able to lead change. I don't know about you, but my world changed completely when I was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It was March 13th, and it was the last time I got on a plane until just 2 weeks ago was the first time I got on a plane again. And I'm not sure when I'm getting on another one, but on March 13th, I got off a plane. I'd been traveling 100,000 miles a year for the past 5 years. And when I was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, I finished up a presentation to a church group of church planters in there. There was this conversation going on about the fact that this coronavirus was beginning to get in the news. We'd had a meeting on Tuesday in our senior administration where we had talked about maybe our school having to go completely online, and even worse, we would ground everybody from travel. And I remember thinking at the time, if my team can't travel, I don't know what we can do. And the guy who literally makes my name leading change was the most resistant guy to change in that meeting. And then all of a sudden, 4 days later, I'm in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I get on a plane from there to Denver. In the Denver airport, United Airlines hands me a Clorox wipe and tells me to wipe down my own seat and my own tray. And everybody starts talking about being extra safe and extra careful. And I realized the world was really different. It had changed dramatically since Tuesday. By the time I got into my Lyft at the LAX airport, it was the last time I've been in an Uber or a Lyft. I was getting texts on my phone that told us that we were 100% online, that I was going to have to ground my whole team, that my 60 staff and I were all going to work remotely. And I've only been back to the campus twice in the last 7 months, once to pick up some books and once to pick up the chair that I'm sitting in today. The world rapidly changed at that moment because of the coronavirus. If you could use chat for a second, and let's just, that was the moment for me when I realized the world was really different, that it had rapidly changed. What was that moment for you? Perhaps that you could just remember what it was like. When was the moment? Just use the chat function and you can type in a brief response that will say something about the way in which you have experienced that change. And feel free to do so. As you're doing so, one of the things I wanted us thinking about is how we are able to adapt to radical change like that. And even though we'll experience it in very different ways. Amy says her son's district finals basketball game was canceled. Other people talked about Sunday worship services, right? My husband, who's a nurse, came home. Look at just as you scroll through here, you start realizing that each of us had different experiences. That was a Friday for me. On Sunday, all of my coaching clients, all of the pastors that I work with, all my DMin students, all of them who run churches, we're all doing Facebook Live services instead of meeting in person. Like churches shut down immediately overnight. Many people tell me that for them, what was the most disruptive is when March Madness was canceled or when the NBA season was canceled. Like now we knew we're serious, right? I'm like, that's really when things must be different. And what's interesting is different people confronted it in different ways, but there was this universal experience of the world changing for everybody all at the same time. And that kind of disruption we have never seen before. I often say that we are in 1918, 1929, and 1968 all at the same time. We're in the midst of a global pandemic, a global recession that is bordering on depression, and global strife around racial injustice that is happening across the world. And all of a sudden to recognize that we are in this completely unprecedented time and trying to figure out how to adapt to that moment. One of the things that helped me when I look back now, a few weeks later, after I was able to get through that initial burst when I observed my own resistance to change. Again, as a person who spends my life leading change, is I realized that what I needed were other voices in my life. I needed other people who could calmly help me lean into the future because they were already living in the future. I had what I call dispatches from the future. One was my son, whose girlfriend works at a convalescent home in Seattle, Washington. They were connected to the earliest outbreaks of the coronavirus. When I was complaining that I thought our school might be overreacting, my son was saying, "Dad, this is not an overreaction. Please take seriously." And he was trying to say to me gently, "Hey, you're an older fella. You need to be especially careful," which was always something to hear from your son. My brother was actually living in northern Italy at the time. And I remember texting him saying, "I heard there's something about a quarantine, a lockdown. Are you okay?" He said, "Last weekend we were all making fun of it. Today we're seeing pictures of our hospitals. Nobody is making fun of it. Please take this seriously." One of my students is an Episcopal priest in Manhattan. On that first Sunday, she was leading Compline services from her apartment because they canceled their morning masses. And I heard people for the very first time ask for prayer for people who had COVID. And that was on March 15th. So all of a sudden you started realizing that part of what we needed was the relationships with other people who I trusted, who could help me prepare for the disrupted future. And what I want to talk about today is the way in which the kinds of things we need in a time of crisis. If you're familiar with my work in Canoeing the Mountains, you know that I've built a lot of the framework for leading in an uncharted territory on the work of Ronald Heifetz and his colleagues at Harvard University. Heifetz writes about adaptive leadership. And in 2009, Heifetz wrote an article with his colleagues called Leadership in a Permanent Crisis. And he was reflecting on the fact that in 2009, we had an unprecedented century. We were only less than 10 years into the century, and we'd already had the 9/11 towers, and we'd had the meltdown of 2008, the recession. He said, "We have never seen a decade like this." Imagine, he had no idea that 2020 was coming, right? And what he talked about is the way to think about a crisis that's helpful is by breaking it into two phases. Phase one is the acute crisis. It's like taking a patient into an emergency room. You stabilize, you protect, you buy time. You have what Andy Crouch and his colleagues call the blizzard mentality. We're gonna hunker down and make it through. And there is a need to actually live into that acute crisis. If you feel as if you are not gonna survive, anything you can do to survive is important. But as soon as there is a stabilization, there's a moment of choice, especially for those of us in leadership. Because when you pass through the acute phase, when you come through the emergency room, when all of a sudden you're stable and you're doing okay, the great temptation is to want to go back to normal. And what Heifetz says is that this is actually the moment when the wise leader recognizes that there's an opportunity in what he calls the adaptive phase to finally address the underlying issues that we've not had the will to confront before the crisis. This is what Andy Crouch and his colleagues call the ice age mentality. This is not just going to be a blizzard. There might get warm for a moment. It might come and go, and it might seem like all of a sudden we're out of the woods. But the truth of the matter is we actually have to think much more long term about the opportunity like this to hit the organizational reset button. And one of the pieces that I want to connect for you is that resilience through a crisis is built on finding purpose and meaning in the crisis. That being able to make the adjustment from acute to adaptive, which is deeply difficult and is not done easily, is actually the key to finding more energy, more hope, more vitality, and ultimately more purpose in the crisis. So once you have stabilized out of the acute crisis phase, you enter into the adaptive phase, and now we begin to look at those underlying issues. Here's one of the ways I want you to think about it. Think for just a second. I don't know if you actually know anybody who has the coronavirus, or if you are just more deeply aware of people, even publicly or in your life, who are susceptible to the coronavirus. My father is 78 years old. He has a number of the underlying conditions that make him particularly a person at risk. When I call him, I always ask, Dad, are you safe? And he will say to me, don't worry, I haven't been out of my cave in months. And I am always relieved, because my dad has neuropathy and he has diabetes and he has some heart issues. If the wrong delivery boy shows up without a mask at his door, it could be really deadly for my dad. And some of us, when we think about this moment of what the pandemic and the global recession and the social uprising have raised, is we begin to now see underlying conditions that are revealed in our congregations that we might be able to address because there's some urgency to them. Can you think of some underlying conditions in your own congregation that have been revealed in this crisis? Perhaps we could begin by chatting some of those in and just share them together. Are there underlying conditions? Can you see that experience? What does that look like in your congregation? People under 35 who attend church don't have as deep a connection, profound loneliness, lack of true connection outside of Sunday service. Thank you, Travis, for that one. Decrease in volunteerism, notice. Discipleship is not up to the moment. Thank you, Larry. Notice these are profoundly difficult, right? These are big issues. And these are the kind of issues that when we think about them, we recognize we've been trying to address them for years. And now what I want to say is that there are opportunities here to address things like leadership structures, as someone says, the need to control and be right. Thank you, Jody. Our aging congregation has found it more challenging to keep ministering due to the pandemic. Of course, Mark, right? You start recognizing these underlying conditions are actually the deeper issues that we have to address that are not going to be solved by going back to normal. They were present in the old normal. And so this is the moment that gives us the opportunity to think about these underlying conditions and then from there begin to address them. Let me highlight a couple that I have seen. And these showed up in your results, and these show up almost every time I do that. These are different forms of these four things. One, there seems to be, most of us are talking about a lack of deep, pervasive discipleship for a persevering church. We have begun to recognize that our approach to discipleship has not created in some of our congregations the kind of winsome, robust, persevering Christians that we have always throughout the centuries held up as our models. We start wondering whether our way of doing church has created a discipleship for a persevering church. A lack of community, some of you recognize this, for keeping relational connections amidst turmoil and change. And, less than a month away from the election, I think all of us are experiencing this, right? That there is deeper division, deeper disconnection, that there's a sense of how easily people can become even more disconnected while lonely for deep community. The lack of extensive leadership capacity. We start recognizing, while our ability to come to gather in a worship service space and a sanctuary on Sunday morning could be different at different places across the country, and it could literally change with each giving week, when there is no assurance that our older models of gathering a congregation together and keeping them together and forming them as a witnessing community are going to be able to be ensured for the next few years. If we start thinking about a more distributed model, working with groups that are smaller, groups that are in homes, groups that are in parks or in neighborhoods, do we have the leadership capacity for that? And then lastly, a lack of resilience for navigating change and disruption. Many churches I know, and even many pastors I know, are experiencing that as there's been increasing conflict and increasing experience of disconnection, that they feel themselves getting more and more discouraged and suffer from a lack of resilience. So how then do we begin to address some of these underlying conditions? One of the things I believe is by actually focusing on the notion of resilience. There's lots of ways people talk about this. This is a theme that is everywhere in our culture today with good reason. Here's one of my favorite definitions. Here's a definition that I used in my most recent book. It's from Andrew Zolli, who studied whole societies that were resilient in the midst of catastrophes. He said, resilience is the capacity to maintain core purpose and integrity in the face of dramatically changed circumstances. Maintain core purpose and integrity in the face of dramatically changed circumstances. If any of you have spent more than 10 minutes with me, you will know that the verb maintain is not a verb that gets me up in the morning. I am not a person who is proud of being a maintainer. I just gave up a role as a senior administrator at our school because I said we have moved from the disruption and change stage into the maintaining and executing stage. And I've got a colleague who's better at that than I am. And I want to go back and work on more change. But what's interesting about resilience is that resilience is about maintaining. But look what it maintains. It's maintaining core purpose. It's maintaining integrity in the face of dramatically changed circumstances. It's maintaining what is critical and crucial. It's holding on to what we cannot lose when everything around us is disrupted. And in this way, resilience is much more like adaptive leadership that is really about the adaptation of our healthiest core organizational DNA in order to thrive and fulfill our mission. So resilience becomes critical to adaptive leadership. Some of the principles and practices for leading adaptive change that I've talked about before include the need to have resilience, especially in the face of sabotage. If there's a kind of disruption that is really difficult, that happens externally to the congregation, the disruption of a pandemic, the disruption of social uprising, of a divisive political environment, of the financial stress and strain on our congregations that leads on our members, that leads to that for our organization. All of those external challenges are not nearly as disruptive and discouraging as the internal resistance that happens within our people when you rally them to face the external challenge. This is really, for most pastors, the most soul-sucking moment. It is when you say, in the light of a changed world, we want to be faithful to the gospel, we're going to be willing to adapt, we're going to be creative, we're going to love our neighbors, we're going to not be about ourselves, we're going to pick up our cross, we're going to go into the world, and someone, you see it on their faces, whether you are face-to-face or sitting on Zoom, they cross their arms and go, yeah, but what about the members who've been here forever? What are we going to do about our programs? How are we going to be here? You're asking us to do a lot. We're tired. And the answer, of course, is yes, those things are true. But for most leaders, this is the most discouraging moment. It is when we face what I talk about in Canoeing the Mountains as sabotage. If you're a leader, Ed Friedman says, expect sabotage. The capacity of a leader to deal with sabotage, Ed Friedman says, could be the most important aspect of leadership. He called it the key to the kingdom. Sabotage is normal, it's natural, it's to be expected. When you call on people to live beyond themselves, the natural result is that they will pull back. Sabotage is what happens when we're anxious. Sabotage is not the bad things that evil people do, but the human things that anxious people do. Sabotage shows up over and over again when you are calling people to change and they are having to face the losses of change, and they normally, naturally, and to be expected, resist it. We see this in the life of Moses, one quick biblical story. In Exodus 13, The people of Israel, the Hebrews, are saved by God. The angel of death goes over over Egypt. The blood is put on the doorknob. The Passover lamb is eaten, and they head out to be freed toward the promised land. God knows, it says in Exodus 13, that they are fearful. So he doesn't send them by the way of the Philistines, afraid that they will go back. He sends them another way, and he sends them right into the cul-de-sac that is blocked by the Red Sea. And when they find themselves facing the Red Sea on one side and chariots coming on the other side, when Pharaoh mobilizes them to go bring back my slaves, they say, it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than die in the wilderness. And we all know the story. It's the greatest story in the Hebrew scriptures. It's the greatest story until the resurrection. God parts the Red Sea. They walk through on dry land. The chariots follow after. The waters cover them. And the Egyptian army ends up dead on the beach. And they are saved. And they step into the wilderness and they have a worship service. At the end of Exodus 14, it says, so the people believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. And in Exodus 15, they do one praise song. And then they start talking about finding lunch. And by Exodus 16:3, 6 weeks after the greatest event in human history, 6 weeks after the greatest miracle in Jewish history, 6 weeks after the king who considered himself a god is vanquished by the God of the Israelites. 6 weeks later, the whole congregation of the Israelites complain against Moses and want to go back. They killed our children, but at least we had leeks and onions. 6 weeks. Can you remember 6 weeks ago? 6 weeks ago was right around Labor Day, right? That's how fast, when people get anxious, they become resistant. What happens to us in those moments, often, Ed Friedman it says that very often what happens is we have a failure of nerve. A failure of nerve is where we would then begin to collude with our people about returning to Egypt. We begin to cave to the pressure. We begin to talk about going back to the status quo. We want to calm them down and assure them that we're not going to have to go too far. And as soon as the anxiety gets high enough and the anger gets high enough, we find ourselves tampering it back. The failure of nerve is a loss of courage to further the mission. It's where we tell ourselves we need to actually slow down or go back. We might have gone too far. And in Exodus 16:3, we see Moses struggling to continue to keep the people going and overcome a failure of nerve. In Numbers 11, you have the next time they grumble in the wilderness about food. And the next time they do, when they finally get tired of eating all this miraculous food that God has provided for them day after day, this time Moses has what I call a failure of heart. This is when he now gets angry at his own people. When a leader says that she is no longer willing to stay with these people, it's literally where Moses says to God, if you want to keep me with these people, kill me now. I would rather be put to death than have to keep with these folk. And we find ourselves in that place very often, right? Maybe we don't say kill me now, but maybe we say, God, if this is the only congregation you're going to give me, let me sell real estate. Let me be in life insurance. Let me do anything else. Or please give me a different people. I know there's supposed to be like pastor search committees by congregations. Could I have a committee or I could find my own congregation? Put me to death. It's a failure of heart. It's when the leader's own discouragement leads them to become cynical of their people, mad at them, angry at them, callous. They begin to abandon their people and the charge they've been given. Internal resistance is often the cause for a changed leader's failure of nerve and failure of heart. So what do we need to do to overcome it? One of my heroes in this regard is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and I'm not alone in this, I know. And if you remember that in August 23rd, 1968, he stood before 250,000 people on the Lincoln Memorial and gave the speech that we all know as the I Have a Dream speech. As these people gathered from around the country, and particularly a vastly African-American group of people gathered from the South to come together to talk about the dream they had. And Martin Luther King Jr. didn't actually have the text of the I Have a Dream section in his prepared remarks. His prepared remarks were actually going to be much more scholarly and sober. He wanted to make sure that he was not accused of raising people to a kind of violence or to too much emotion. He knew that the world was watching, and so he did a very concrete, sober analysis based on an analogy of a bad check. He said the United States of America gave the African-American citizens of its country a promissory note, and that note has been returned insufficient funds. They have not made good on the American dream. And as he laid out this argument, he hit a moment when he hit the line that he thought would make the impact. And like a good preacher, seeing that it didn't work, he stumbles on the line, he moves his notes to the side, and behind him, Mahalia Jackson, a gospel singer who'd been traveling with him, he whispers out loud in a voice that he could hear, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." And Clarence B. Jones, who had been with him all night writing the speech, turned to his companion next to him and said to him, "These people don't know, but they're all about to go to church." And he launches into a section of Isaiah, where it talks about the mountains will be made low, the rough places made a plain, the crooked places straight, and the river will go through it. And with this vision of the future hope of the world renewed, King says, with this faith, we go back to the South. With this faith, we go back to Mississippi and Alabama and back to the potential jailings and the potential beatings. With this faith, we go back into the struggle, he says. With this faith, we'll be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we'll be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. Most of you are preachers. You know, he just did an amazing job of parallelism there, where you take 2 points to make one. Hew out of the mountain of despair, transform the jangling discords of our nation. The question that we want to ask ourselves is, what does it become to become a tool that can hew? Not a sledgehammer that smashes through resistance as strong as this resistance was. We're talking about a mountain of despair that was 400 years old, and not a dynamite that would blow it up, and not a weakness that would cower in front of it, but a tool that can hew it, that can transform it. How do we become a tool that can hew? The analogy that I want to just briefly reflect with you a bit is the whole notion of becoming a tempered tool. A tempered tool like a chisel that can be used by a master craftsman to carve out of despair stones of hope. I don't know about you, but don't you hear like the language of 1 Peter, come to him a living stone and let yourselves as living stones be built into a dwelling place for God? Can we believe that the resistance that we are facing is actually the context for our resilience to bring transformation? And the imagery that I want to use here is one of a tempered tool, a tool that has a tempered resilience, a grounded identity, and a resilient character that is shaped through reflection, relationships, and a rule of life in a rhythm of leading and not leading. This is the pattern for forging tempered resilience. A tempering is an interesting word, right? A tempered tool is a tool that is both stronger than its original material and more flexible. It is because it has been shaped and forged and formed, it has more strength And because it has been cooled and filed and it has been had the process of tempering put into it, it has the capacity to flex and to be used instead of just simply become brittle and broken. A process of reflection, relationships, and a rule of life. So what I want to do for just a moment is give you a brief lesson in blacksmithing. My wife and I took a blacksmithing class in Los Angeles, California. There's an urban blacksmithing community. There has not been a horse here in 100 years, but there are a group of blacksmiths. And this was my anvil. They gave me my own anvil in front of my own forge, and they let me put my name on it, and they gave me a set of tools, and they gave me some steel, and they told me to take the tongs and put the steel into the fire. And while the steel was in the fire, then they started giving me the safety lecture. I was already blacksmithing before I started learning. And my experience of watching that steel be plunged into that fire so that it could become molten, so that it could be shaped, was the experience I felt that most leaders have every single day, where we are plunged into the fire of crisis and conflict. And we are being and we need to be shaped by the hands of God, who is the ultimate blacksmith, shaping us into a tempered tool. What I learned in this experience is that in the same way that you shape a tool through the process of working and heating and holding and hammering and hewing and tempering, we go through a process. Leaders go through the process. We are formed in the leading. In the same way that you can't learn blacksmithing by watching it on television, that you actually have to get into the shop that is dangerous and feel the heat and hear the pounding. Most of us struggle with leadership is because we were experts before we became leaders. We were expert teachers or preachers or pastoral care or programmatic leaders. And then all of a sudden we became leaders and we realized we were being formed all over again. And it feels vulnerable. The hardest part about leadership is that it's vulnerable, that you actually find yourself feeling more ill-equipped at exactly the moment when people are looking at you for answers. And adaptive leadership requires for you not to fall back onto your expertise, but instead to move forward by calling people into a process of vulnerable leadership, which requires self-reflection, that requires holding relationships that are like an anvil that hold us, and a process that shapes us, and a practice over and over again that over time not only makes the tool stronger, but accomplishes the transformation. And that there needs to be a rhythm of leading and not leading. This notion of becoming a tempered leader is at the core of developing the resilience needed in order to lead change. It's how we step into the resistance and the sabotage that comes our way, and it's how we develop the strength through both vulnerability and relationship that enables us to be able to be transformed. And it is this process that we need to continue to give ourselves to if we're going to be tempered leaders. Let me stop sharing for the moment, and we'll take some questions, and then I'll give you a couple things to talk about before we go back into some groups for a bit. But let me just be glad to let Mike and some others kind of cultivate some questions. If you have some questions or comments that you'd like to put into the chat, this would be a good time for us to have a bit of a discussion about that.
Thank you, Todd. And we do have some questions. Yeah, we'll take about 10 minutes before we go breakouts. And so there's some great questions coming in. I'm going to start with one that actually just came in. The question is, out of a difficult experience, the question is, can it be built in a leadership team in the moment that is anxious? He's talking about resilience here. Anxious, and they are short-circuiting and sabotaging and experiencing the pastor as a damaging chisel. So where do you start? That's the question.
Yeah. Well, this is, I appreciate that question because this really is in many ways where we find ourselves. So the very first thing that many of us have discovered is we were not shaped we were not tempered tools for this moment. We were not created to take on the granite chisel in front of the granite mountain in front of us. We were created for a moment where we would be, I say sometimes we're more like shovels working in really good soil, wanting to plant a garden. We don't see ourselves as having to go up against rocks and needing to be tools. So here's the part about it. The only place that you can develop it is in the moment. What it requires is that you as a leader start your own process of transformation, which requires you to start with vulnerability and connection. I would say the two images to keep in your mind is the steel goes into the fire. And when they were giving me our lesson, they said to us, okay, so reach in and pull the steel out of the fire. And here's what you're going to look at. It doesn't look any different. It's 700 degrees. Don't touch it. It'll burn the skin off your hands, but it's not ready to shape it yet. Put it back into the fire. It has to be 2000 degrees. It has to be orange, oozy, red, molten, falling apart. And that experience is the experience of vulnerability that you have to lead your team into, acknowledging that it feels vulnerable, that we're going to have to be able to say that we don't know, that we don't have the perfect answers, we're not experts, but that we are going to go through it together. And that's the imagery of the anvil. The anvil is your relationships. So in a moment of vulnerability, you have to have a set of relationships that are secure and solid, and trustworthy. And I say for every leader, I would encourage you to think about this. You need in your life, if you're going to lead change, you need 3 sets of relationships. You need partners who are going to be willing to withstand the heat with you, which means inviting them into their own vulnerability. You need mentors who can hold you and guide you and that you can become humble in front of. And you need friends. You need people who care more about you than they care about whether you're successful as a leader. You need a thick, heavy anvil of relationships that hold you in your vulnerability. And what you start with your team is developing that capacity for vulnerability and that capacity for relationships and trust. And that's where you start.
All right, thanks, Todd. I'm going to paraphrase this next question. So it was around this sort of paradoxical idea of resilience versus safety. And really the premise of the question was there's so much emphasis on messages, and what we hear is we'll keep you safe. There's this emphasis on you're in danger, we'll keep you safe, whether it's, you know, in the public sector, in churches, institutions, whatever. Resilience, though, if I'm hearing you right, and if we're hearing you right, is so much more than that. So I'm wondering if you could just say a word on that.
Yeah, so one of the questions to really think through is where is our safety in Christ, right? So in one sense, actually, this is a place where it really very interesting to me. One of the best examples I watched was Andy Stanley, of all people, who in his megachurch said, I can't keep you all safe. We can't possibly create a worship experience that can have thousands of you gathering that can keep you safe. What I can do is tell you that we will instead focus on developing a deeper sense of community. And I was stunned. I actually, to be honest, I don't know Andy personally, but to hear a mega church pastor say, we can't possibly guarantee your safety, so we're going to do everything possible we can to encourage you to be as safe as possible. And what we're going to do in the meantime is build our connection. We're going to build our trust and our sense of community even over distance and even over the internet. And I think what it helps us point to is not just how do we keep ourselves safe. Most people hear safe and they hear status quo. Oh, it'd be safer if we went back to slavery. What they're saying is we're going to actually be as wise as possible to develop the capacity to move forward. And yeah, there will be some loss along the way.
Perfect. Thank you. So a couple of people are kind of wondering the same thing. Let me get back to the question. Well, basically it was, yeah, there we go. When there is sabotage, how do you move into a place of vulnerability and trust? And I'm going to combine that with a second question that I think relates to it, although I'll defer to you on this, and that is, say a little bit more about this rhythm of leading and not leading and how that all kind of works together, if you would.
Yeah. So I'll separate those for a second, and then I'll bring them back together. Think about sabotage as this. Sabotage is what happens when anxiety takes over a system. You know you have sabotage when people are saying stuff like, hey, we just need to go back to, if there's any desire to go back, right? I just always say to people, remember the word familiar is related to the word family. And so most of us are more afraid of feeling homeless than we are of going back to a dysfunctional home. So we are more likely to want to return to something that feels familiar than to feel disoriented and disconnected, that in a way that feels kind of spiritually homeless. What you have to be able to do is create the relationships to say, we are going to be a traveling people who are going to move through this together, so that what is familiar is going to be the relationships and not the past. And that's really hard. I mean, it's just hard. It's the hardest work we have to do, to lead people into the future when all they want to do is go back to what they feel like they've lost, is the challenge. That's why Friedman called this the key to the kingdom. And it is incredibly hard work, and it is deeply relational work. One of the reasons why I talk about this anvil and about the relationships is that when you start leading people through their own vulnerability, they have to feel well held while they are traveling. They have to feel a sense that we are leading using empathy and relationships to move people into the scary part of the unknown, but to keep them moving forward. So whenever I'm talking to pastors who are talking about, like, say, the pandemic or the coronavirus, I say, if you could do anything, just get rid of two things in your vocabulary. One is the idea that we're going to go back to anything. And the second one is that the church is closed at all. The church is not closed. We are a church that is open to the Spirit and open to the mission of God in the world. We are a community of people who are doing everything we can to be open to what God is doing in our midst. And we are moving forward by the power of the Spirit into the new day that we will discover. That mindset is really, really tiring. It's demanding. So one of the parts that I realized about tempering a tool is that when you're using the fire and the anvil and the hammer to shape a tool, the tool is becoming more and more stressed. It's becoming harder. You temper it by cooling it down. And one of the things that every leader needs is rhythms in their life where they are leading and not leading, where they have moments in their life where they are in the middle of the fire and they are also able to be away from the fire. You need to have places and practices that enable you to get the stress out of your system so that you can come back to the system. And there has to be this rhythm of leading and not leading. In the same way that when you're shaping a tool, you'll pound it and then eventually you let it cool all the way down so that eventually it becomes more flexible and it gets the stress out of the system. And it's that rhythm, it's that relationships and rhythm that is the key of resilience.
That is so good. So I'm going to do two more questions, and then we'll do breakouts. This is rich, and I apologize to everybody that we can't do all the questions because they're really good. But one of the questions that came in earlier, and I suspect a lot of us, almost all of us, can relate to this, is for most of us, when we turn leadership over, meaning elders and deacons, it's something like 33% turnover every year, the way we do things. And so kind of the gist of the question was just about the time you start gaining momentum with one group, you got to bring on another group. And I'm wondering if you could kind of, address that a little bit, talk about your thoughts on that dynamic.
Yeah, so this is actually one of the reasons why, and this is this is where when I talk to groups like this, I feel like I'm always giving them just more and more complexity and bad news. Like I feel like people get with me and they're like, really, it's even harder than you said. What this points to is we have to build what Heifetz calls adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity is what we're talking about. It's the capacity to learn. It's the capacity to deal with loss. It's the capacity to navigate competing values and go through transformation in order to fulfill your mission. Adaptive capacity. it starts with you as the leader. You have to develop your own adaptive capacity, your own resilience to learn, to go through loss, to navigate competing values, to deal with sabotage and resistance. And then you have to do it with your leaders. But because we lead in a church where the congregation itself becomes the leaders, we have to do it with the entire congregation. This is actually why one of my favorite books, and if you want to put another book besides mine in the notes, this would be the one. It is Lessons in Leadership by Jonathan Sacks. Jonathan Sacks is a Jewish rabbi. He was the chief rabbi of London. After studying adaptive leadership, he took his leadership team through a year-long study of the Torah, studying it from an adaptive leadership perspective. And what he said is what makes Jews unique is that we are the people of God, the people who believe that God has made every Jew a leader. And I want to say that every Christian who is called to live out the kingdom of God in their lives, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth, has the exact same calling, which means we must continue to make adaptive capacity and resilience part of our discipleship, which is where most of my work is heading, and most all my students are working on right now. How do we develop the formational practices that develop adaptive capacity in an entire congregation? Because as you said, you just can't do it with your small team of leaders or even your board. It has to be the work of the entire people.
Yeah, awesome. One last question, Todd, and then we're going to kind of turn this, and you're going to ask us a question. We'll do a brief breakout. Please don't leave after the breakout because there'll be some concluding remarks. You won't want to miss that. Well, one last question, and it regards pace of change. So obviously we are in a different, we live in a different world than we've ever lived in, for those of us who are here. And there is COVID, and then there's post-COVID, and no one quite knows what that looks like. But as it regards resilience and adaptability, I'm wondering, how pace of change fits into all that. Understanding each of us have a little different culture within our church, different leadership, all that. So I wonder if you could just say a word on that.
Well, this is one of the reasons why I think this language of acute and adaptive phases is really important. I actually, when I read this, and I've been talking about this a lot the last few months, ever since the pandemic's hit, because what it allows us to recognize is when you're in an acute phase, literally what needs to happen is everybody needs to learn how to take a deep breath. I mean, literally, what do you do when you roll someone into the emergency room? You make sure they're breathing. And there is a place where some of our congregations, that's exactly what we need to do. We need to huddle up and take care of people. And even now we're huddling up over Zoom and taking care of people so that they can calm down. The challenge is that right when it gets comfortable, you've got to remind people that there's work to do. And this is what's hard. So the pacing of change has to be a continual pacing between the acute phase and the adaptive phase. And this is the work of the leader, where you are basically saying to people, we're going to take a deep breath, and then we are going to keep going. We're going to make sure we're okay, and then we're going to address these issues. And somebody put it in their chat, and I think you're right. Some of the underlying issues are not just about pre-pandemic, they're pre-decline. Canoeing the Mountains was written 5 years before the pandemic. I started writing Canoeing the Mountains about the fact that we were going through decline in a post-Christendom world. All this has done is accelerated it. So part of what we have to be willing to do is to know that the pacing difference is really important.
Yeah, for me at least, and I think for all of us, that is really helpful. So thanks so much, Todd. Todd is going to come back to us, but right now he's got a question, and we're going to break out in breakout rooms. Again, you don't have to do anything. You'll be assigned and you'll be taken back, but 10 minutes in breakout rooms. And I believe you're going to leave us with a question, Todd?
Yeah, basically what I've done is I have a typical way of asking people to reflect on this material that allows them to focus on where they are. And I put it in the chat. It's basically pick one of these prompts: inspire, inquire, irk, require. Is there something that inspires you that you've heard that energizes you? Is there something that confuses you that you want to inquire about? Is there a question that you need to get answered so you can move forward? Is there something that irks you, that bothers you, that you just would like to be able to talk about? Or is there something that requires a change that you know you need to change? And what I would encourage you to do in your group is just pick one of those prompts, share that together, and then get some support from the people around you. Inspire, inquire, or require. I'll just drop it in the chat and it should be available to everybody right there. I just want to end with a thought that literally in one sense takes us back to the beginning, and it could be one of the most important pieces of all. I'll share my screen briefly again, when I talked about tempered resilience being a grounded identity and resilient character, in the book I spend quite a bit of time talking about the importance of our grounded identity as the raw material for a leader. The leadership actually starts in our identity and people who are being called by God to this very task. And so the experience that I've seen is really around what I call the notion of how a grounded identity leads to ultimately to becoming a resilient person through these adding some of these other capacities along the way. So let me just end with this moment of what it means to be grounded. And I see this particularly in the life of Jesus. In Mark 1, 9 through 11, this is the Message version. At this time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. The moment he came out of the water, he saw the sky split open and God's Spirit looking like a dove come down on him. Along with the Spirit, a voice, "You are my son, chosen and marked by my love, pride of my life." If I could give you any gift today of anything I've said to remember this. This was said to Jesus before he did anything for God. The very first thing Jesus heard before he went into the wilderness, before he took up the temptations, before he did a single miracle, before he preached a single sermon, is, "You are my beloved. You are chosen and marked by my love, pride of my life." And I believe that for leaders, particularly to develop resilience, they have to have this sense of being grounded in something other than their success in leading change. Most of us are going to be of a generation that doesn't see the kind of renewal or revival of the church that we might want to see in our lifetime. Many of us might be people who are part of a generation who will die in a wilderness before the church comes to a new day of renewal or promised land. And what we want to be is the faithful people who pass on the church and the ministry to the next generation. And in order to do so, you must be grounded something other than your success in leading change. Many congregations are going to struggle. Some are going to die. Some are going to resist and want to go back into slavery. And your leadership and your capacity to be a good leader is not a reflection of your identity. It's the opposite. Your identity must be grounded in something other to be a good leader. And I learned this some years ago when I was at Ironman Canada. I'd come out of a sabbatical. I had a couple of years of doing some in-depth training to check off a bucket list thing, which was to participate in the Ironman. And the keynote speaker the night before was a nun, Sister Madonna Buter, who is the world record holder at age 75 and 80 for women in the Ironman. And they call her Iron Nun. And she stood in front of an entire group of people who had spent years training for this moment to swim 2 miles, to bike 112, to run a marathon all in one day. And she said to them, "I want you to know that whatever your goals are tomorrow and whatever your day is like tomorrow, someday tomorrow, remember this fact. You were loved into existence. You were loved into existence." And what I would want you to know is wherever you find yourself today, facing resistance, more important is that you were loved into existence. Your identity must be grounded in something other than your success in leading change. I already gave you the notes for how you can reach me. One of the simplest ways to get some more resources is just to text the word uncharted to 66866. It's too many sixes in a row for a pastor, but if you will just text that word uncharted to 66866, we'll connect you to a bunch of free resources and make ourselves available to you to serve you in your own leadership. So there you go.
Todd, thank you so much. I'm getting text messages and things in the chat. Just so thankful for your presentation today and how helpful it's been. and also a desire, I think, for a lot of people to go deeper. And so just a reminder, if you want to be part of a group, a cohort that talks about Todd's new book coming out, you can sign up for that at vibrantcongregations.org. And we're going to start those in January. The book comes out, as you noticed, in November. And so we're not going to make you work during Advent on this book. We'll give you that space, and we'll get back together after that. In November, however, we do have another one of these, and it's Lisa Sharon Harper is going to be with us. She wrote the book, The Very Good Gospel, that talks about God's amazing shalom and how that touches all parts of our world and all parts of life. And so we invite you back for that. If you signed up for this one, you will automatically receive a link on the morning of it. But if you want to sign up again, feel free. But we'll make sure that all gets out. And in about a week to 10 days, we'll have notes and other links and so on at the Vibrant Congregations website that you can look there. But thanks to all. And again, Todd, thank you so much for being with us. It's been marvelous. You all have a good day.